In the middle of Central Park, surrounded by bodyguards and silence, the most feared man in New York felt a tiny hand wrap around two of his fingers, and a little girl with his eyes looked up at him and whispered one word that shattered 3 years of secrets: Daddy. He had buried enemies, broken men twice his size, and never once flinched. But in that moment, Luca Moretti forgot how to breathe. If you've ever loved someone from a distance because you believed your absence was the only protection you could offer, this story is for you. Watch until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The park was loud with the ordinary kind of noise: pigeons scattering from a child's thrown bread crust, a bicycle bell somewhere near the southern entrance, a woman laughing too hard at something her phone showed her. None of it touched Luca Moretti. He moved through the afternoon the way he moved through every room, every negotiation, every funeral, like a weather system, like something that did not belong to the world it passed through but could reshape it completely if it chose to. He was not supposed to be here. The original plan had been a walk from the townhouse to the black SUV waiting on Central Park West, 15 minutes of fresh air between a morning of financial restructuring and an afternoon meeting with the Port Authority's most expensive liaison. Adrian had suggested it. "You haven't slept properly in 3 days, boss. Take the air." And Luca had agreed mostly because arguing required energy. He was conserving for things that mattered. He was 41 days out from the shooting. The scar tissue beneath his left rib still pulled when he breathed deeply. The doctor had explained it with diagrams and careful language: penetrating trauma, significant hemorrhaging, remarkable recovery, given your age and stress levels. But what Luca remembered most from those first conscious hours in the private medical suite was not the pain or the machines or the face of his surgeon. What he remembered was the ceiling. White and absolutely still, indifferent to everything happening beneath it. He had stared at that ceiling and understood, with the particular clarity that near death sometimes grants, that he had been staring at ceilings like it his entire adult life. Blank surfaces, safe surfaces. Surfaces that asked nothing. He stopped near a bench beside the conservatory water, where model sailboats moved in small arcs across the pond's surface. He did not sit. Men like him did not sit in public parks unless they were making a point, and he had no point to make today. He simply stood with his hands folded behind his back, watching the boats, and let himself have 4 minutes of something approaching peace. That was when he heard the child. Not the crying. There was always crying somewhere in a park this size, some toddler registering a grievance with the fundamental injustice of the universe. This was different. This was laughter, the specific kind that has no self-awareness in it, pure animal delight. A little girl running along the path to his left with her arms spread wide like she was trying to gather the whole afternoon into herself. She was maybe 3. Dark curls loose around a face that was— his brain stuttered for a moment, misprocessed something. A face that stopped him the way very few things stopped him anymore. She ran directly into the side of his leg. Not aggressively, not even accidentally, not really. She simply hadn't been looking where she was going, and his leg was there, and she hit it and sat down hard on the path and looked up at him with enormous eyes that were the exact color of deep water before a storm. Blue-gray. The precise shade that had looked back at him from bathroom mirrors his entire life. He did not move. She looked at him for a long moment, 3 full seconds of the unfiltered assessment that only very small children and very old cats are capable of. And then she reached up with both arms the way children reach for things they've already decided belong to them. "Daddy," she said. The word hit him somewhere below his sternum, in the same general region where a 9mm round had recently introduced itself. He felt his lungs lock. Behind the girl, footsteps, fast, alarmed, the particular rhythm of a parent who has lost visual contact for 30 seconds and is now recalibrating their entire afternoon. "Lily, Lily, baby, stop." And then Sarah Bennett rounded the bend in the path and saw him, and everything that had been moving in Luca Moretti's world simply ceased. She was different. 3 years had done something to her face, not aged it exactly, but pressed something harder into the lines around her mouth, something careful and watchful that hadn't been there before. Her hair was shorter. She was wearing a jacket that was slightly too large for her, the kind of jacket that gets grabbed on the way out the door when someone is perpetually running 5 minutes late, which she always had been. She was still beautiful in the way that had undone him. Not aggressively, not performatively, but with the quiet, stubborn force of something that simply existed and couldn't help it. She stopped 3 feet from him. For a moment, neither of them breathed. Lily, still sitting on the path between them, looked from her mother's face to the man's face and back again, interpreting something in adult expressions that she didn't have words for yet, but understood perfectly well. "Mama," she said helpfully. "Man." Sarah's voice came out flat and controlled, which told him more than shaking would have. "She doesn't know who you are." "I know," Luca said. "She just does that sometimes. With men who have—" She stopped, started again. "She's not used to—" She stopped again. "I know," he said. A long silence fell between them, filled with the sound of sailboats and pigeons, and the distant laughter of people who were not carrying 3 years of deliberate silence like stones in their chests. Sarah reached down and picked up Lily with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times alone, settling the child on her hip. Lily immediately grabbed a fistful of her mother's collar and rested her chin on Sarah's shoulder, still watching Luca with those unsettling eyes. "You look terrible," Sarah said finally. "I was shot 5 weeks ago." Something moved across her face, fast, involuntary, gone before he could fully read it. "I heard." "From who?" "Does it matter?" It didn't. His world was porous in ways that couldn't be fully controlled, and Sarah had spent 3 years developing her own quiet intelligence network. People who owed her things for reasons that had nothing to do with him. He'd known that. He'd allowed it, even, in the same oblique way he'd allowed certain protective arrangements without her knowledge. The apartment building with the security system she thought was standard. The landlord who answered to a property management company that answered, ultimately, to an accounting firm that answered to a name she didn't know. Small, invisible walls between his daughter and a world that wanted to use her against him. "I need to talk to you," he said. "No." Flat, final. The same tone she'd used 3 years ago when she'd left, except then it had broken in the middle, and this time it didn't. "Sarah, not here." She shifted Lily on her hip. "Not like this. Not in front of—" She gestured at the 2 men standing 12 feet behind him, pretending to be absorbed in their phones. "Not like this," she said again. He nodded once. "Tell me when and where." She looked at him for a long moment, and he understood she was trying to decide whether the answer was never or something more complicated. "I'll think about it," she said. She turned and walked away, and Lily looked back at him over her mother's shoulder the entire time until they turned a corner and were gone. Luca stood by the model boat pond for another 4 minutes. Then he walked back to the SUV, got in, and told Adrian to drive. He did not explain what had happened. He sat in the back seat for the entire ride uptown and stared at his hands and thought about a pair of blue-gray eyes that were not his and also were entirely his, and understood that whatever damage control he had been running for 3 years had just failed completely. He had met Sarah Bennett on a Tuesday in November, which was relevant only because November in Brooklyn is the month that strips everything unnecessary away. The cold comes in without ceremony. The trees lose their pretense. What remains is structure, the bones of things, visible and honest for the first time since spring. He'd been in the neighborhood for the wrong reasons, the kind of wrong that required personal rather than delegated attention, which meant going places without the full entourage, which meant stopping at a diner on Atlantic Avenue at 10 in the evening because the alternative was 4 more hours of adrenaline and violence sitting in his system with nowhere to go. The diner was the kind of place that had not changed since 1987 and was proud of it. Cracked vinyl on the stools. A coffee machine that sounded like it was working through personal issues. A television above the counter showing a weather report that no one was watching. 3 other customers. An old man with a newspaper. A couple who appeared to be arguing in the specific exhausted way that means they've been arguing about this particular thing for years and have no intention of stopping. Sarah had taken his order without looking at him. "What do you want?" Not in a rude way, in the way of someone who had been on their feet since 6 a.m. and was conserving what remained of their energy for things that required it. He'd said coffee and whatever was hot, and she'd said the soup was good tonight, her roommate's cousin's recipe. And something about the complete normalcy of that sentence had punched through 3 layers of armor he hadn't known he was wearing. He'd had the soup. He'd had more coffee than was medically advisable. He'd stayed until closing because she was still there, and the rest of the world was not. And by the end of it, she knew his first name and he knew that she was working two jobs, studying for a degree, she was taking one class at a time, and had absolutely no interest in being impressed by anyone. Most guys who come in here alone at night want to tell you their whole life story, she'd said, stacking chairs. You haven't told me anything. There's not much worth knowing. She'd given him a look over the back of a chair that said she considered that highly unlikely. Everybody's got something worth knowing. Al, he'd said, which was not his name but was close enough to a name he'd been called that it didn't feel entirely like a lie. Sarah, she'd said, don't come back unless you're going to tell me something real. He'd come back the next night and told her his mother had died when he was 9, that he'd learned to cook because there had been no one else to do it, that he had never owned a dog because he didn't trust himself with something that needed consistency. These were real things, true things, offered in exchange for learning that her father had left when she was 12, that she sent money home to her mother in Ohio every month. Even though money was tight, that she could identify every ingredient in a dish from a single bite, and had always wanted to go to cooking school but had put it off for so long it had started to feel like something that happened to other people. He'd kissed her 3 weeks later in the parking lot behind the diner in a light rain, and she'd kissed him back without hesitation, and for the next 4 months he had lived 2 completely separate lives, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been doing exactly that in different contexts for 20 years. The difference was that one of those lives had started to feel more real than the other. He'd told himself it was controlled. He told himself the arrangement was clear in his own mind, that the lines were established, that he was simply allowing himself a small private geography of ordinary life without compromising anything fundamental. He knew this was a lie. He knew it the first time he found himself choosing the diner over a meeting that could have been rescheduled, and the second time when he spent 40 minutes in a jewelry store, not because he'd decided anything, but because looking felt safe, and the third time when she said, "I love you," very quietly and without warning while they were washing dishes in her apartment, and he hadn't been able to say it back, but had stood there with a wet plate in his hand, feeling like the floor had relocated. What ended it was not a fight. What ended it was the night she came home to find Marco Bellini sitting in her kitchen. He hadn't sent Marco. Marco had gone on his own initiative, which told Luca several things he should have understood sooner about the nature of his closest advisor's judgment. But the damage was already done. Sarah had come home to find a man she'd never seen before sitting at her table with the casual ownership of someone who had decided the space was his, and Marco had said something careless and precise about the nature of her relationship with Luca, his real name, not Al, and the kind of business Luca was in, and by the time Luca arrived she was already gone. She'd left a note. 4 words. Don't look for me. He had looked. Of course he had looked. But when he found out 3 months later that she was pregnant, he'd stopped. Not because he didn't want to find her, because he understood, with cold clarity, that finding her would mean bringing her back into a world where Marco Bellini could walk into her kitchen uninvited, where enemies with long memories and no moral constraints could reach a child to break a father. He had seen it done. He had, on 2 occasions that he did not allow himself to think about directly, been the one doing it. He left her alone. He kept her safe through systems she couldn't see. He learned about the baby, and then he learned about the genetic condition, a cardiac defect that ran in Moretti blood, recessive but possible, the kind of thing that didn't always manifest but absolutely could, the kind of thing that required early screening and monitoring to catch before it became fatal. His uncle had died of it at 34. He'd spent years quietly funding pediatric cardiac research under names that didn't connect back to him, and now his own child might need the interventions he'd been paying to develop. He learned it was a girl. He did not let himself name her, even privately, because naming her would make her real in a way he could not afford. Sarah named her Lily. He found that out from the birth record, which appeared in a database that his people monitored because he had told himself it was just information, just surveillance, not attachment. Lily Elena Bennett. Born at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday in March. He had read that document and then put it in a drawer and not taken it out again for 2 years, which was itself a form of lying he'd become very good at. The phone rang at 7 a.m., the morning after the park encounter. It was a number he recognized, one of several he'd established for Sarah's use in emergencies, routed through 3 different services, untraceable in any meaningful sense. She had never called it before. He picked up on the second ring. "I'll meet you," she said. No preamble. Tomorrow. The place on 54th. The coffee place with the green awning. 9 a.m. You come alone, and I mean actually alone, not your guys wait around the corner alone. Agreed. A pause. I'm not... She stopped. I have questions. I know. A lot of them. I know that too. Another pause, longer. He could hear something in the background, faint, distant. A children's program. The particular bright voices of animated characters making learning sound like an adventure. Luca, she said, and the name in her mouth after 3 years of silence was a specific and precise kind of pain. I need you to understand that this conversation is for me, not for you. Not because I've decided anything. I have questions, and I deserve answers, and that is the only reason I'm doing this. That's fair, he said. It's not a negotiation. I understand. And don't... Her voice caught, just slightly, just enough for him to hear. Don't say you're sorry, I can't. Just don't start with that. Okay, he said. She hung up. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment. Through the tall windows of the townhouse, Manhattan was doing what it always did in early morning, reasserting itself, reminding anyone watching that it did not care about individual narratives, that it had been here before all of them and would be here after. He found, unexpectedly, that he did not find this comforting the way he once had. He called Adrian. The meeting tomorrow morning, he said. Cancel it. Which one? All of them. A pause. Everything? Everything. He set the phone down on the windowsill. And Adrian, the situation from yesterday, in the park. I saw, Adrian said carefully. Nobody talks about that. Of course. Nobody. Not the guys who were with me, not... Nobody. Understood. He ended the call and went to make coffee and stood in his kitchen in the silence of early morning, thinking about a little girl with his eyes who had reached for him with absolute confidence, as if the idea that he might not reach back was simply not a possibility she had considered. He thought about what it meant to be trusted that completely by someone who did not yet know they had every reason not to trust him. He was still thinking about it an hour later when he found himself standing in the doorway of the room he had never decorated, the one on the 3rd floor that his housekeeper had asked about twice, and he had told her to leave empty. It was empty now. Bare walls, wood floor, afternoon light coming in through a window he'd never thought to cover. He stood there for a long time without knowing what he was looking for. He knew what it should look like. He'd walked past toy stores and children's furniture places dozens of times without stopping. He'd never let himself stop. He closed the door and went back downstairs. The coffee place on 54th had 8 tables and made its money on regulars, the kind of neighborhood institution that exists in the interstices of New York's attention, unremarkable enough to be genuinely private. He was there at 8:40, against his own instructions to himself, because he could not manage to stay in the townhouse any longer. He took a table in the back corner. He ordered coffee he didn't need and sat with his hands around the cup and watched the door. She came in at 9:03, which told him something about the night she'd had. Sarah Bennett was constitutionally incapable of being late, had always arrived 7 to 10 minutes early for everything, had once told him that lateness was a form of disrespect she couldn't tolerate, because her time had always been too tight to waste. 3 minutes late meant she'd sat outside in the cold debating whether to come in. She saw him immediately, crossed the room without hesitation, and sat down across from him with her coat still on, her bag on the table between them like a small declaration of territory. She looked tired. Not the tired of a bad night, but the tired of years, compounded and compressed into the lines around her eyes, the specific economy of her movements that comes from never having quite enough energy and having learned to work around that. "Hi," she said. "Hi." A waitress materialized. Sarah ordered tea without looking at the menu and without elaborating, the shorthand of someone who has been ordering in busy places for too long to be charmed by the ritual. When the waitress left, silence. He had prepared for this. He had spent 20 years learning to control the temperature of rooms, to manage the pacing of difficult conversations, to read what the other person needed and calibrate accordingly. He had walked into meetings where men wanted him dead and come out having restructured the terms in his favor. He was very good at this. He had nothing. "You look worse in good light," she said finally. "The scar?" "Left side." How bad? Could have been worse. Her jaw tightened slightly. Could have been worse is not an answer. I was in surgery for 6 hours. I was unconscious for almost 2 days. I'm told the recovery is going well, which I interpret to mean I'm not dead yet, which I consider an ongoing project. Something that was almost not a smile crossed her face. You always talked like that, like being alive was a contingency plan. In my world, it usually is. The tea arrived. She wrapped her hands around the mug and looked at him with the direct assessment that had disarmed him in that diner 7 years ago. The look that didn't perform examination but simply performed it, simply saw. Lily asked me last night, she said, why she doesn't have a daddy. He was quiet. She's asked before. I've had different answers at different ages. When she was really small, it was some families are different, and she accepted that. Last year, it was your daddy lives far away, which was, she stopped, which was a lie. But she was 2.5, and it was a lie I could live with. Last night, she asked if daddies could come back. He made himself hold her gaze. I didn't know what to say. Her voice was steady. And then she asked if her daddy knew about her. A long pause. Does he know about me? He repeated quietly. That's what she asked. Yes. He set his coffee cup down. What did you tell her? I told her yes. Because you do. The word do landed like a small, heavy thing. You've always known, haven't you? It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're confirming what they already suspected, and the confirmation still cost them something. I assumed the building security that was significantly better than what the rent should cover. The landlord who couldn't quite explain who owned the property when I asked. The car that's been parked on my block since, she stopped. You've been watching us the whole time. Protecting. You've been surveilling us, she said, and her voice was still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been building for years. From a distance. Anonymously. Without our knowledge or consent. Lily doesn't have a father. She has surveillance. Sarah, don't. She held up one hand. I need you to hear that before you explain. I need you to understand what that is. You have been present for 3 years in the most parasitic possible way. Watching, controlling, deciding what protection we needed, without once considering that we might have needed you. Not the security system, not the property company, you. He could have argued. He had a case, not a good one, but a case. The threats had been real. The risk to them had been real. 2 of the men who would have used them against him were dead, and a third was in federal custody. And the casual arithmetic of violence that he understood better than any cost-benefit analysis made it clear that his decision had been correct in the precise, operational sense of having preserved their lives. He didn't make the case. You're right, he said. She blinked. She'd been prepared for the argument. She'd been prepared for the explanation. She'd rehearsed her responses to it. He could tell, had set up the whole architecture of the conversation around dismantling justifications. His agreement broke the structure. I'm right, she said carefully. That's it? Yes. You're not going to tell me you were protecting us. I was protecting you, and you're right that it wasn't enough. Both of those things are true, and I'm not going to use the first one to cancel the second. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, someone walked past the window with a stroller, the ordinary motion of the morning world going on without reference to any of this. Why now? She said. Why? You've been sick before. You've had close calls before, I assume. Why does this one make you… She stopped. The cardiac report, he said. Her expression shifted. What? The inherited condition, the one that runs in… that can affect… He stopped. Found more precise words. I had a workup done 6 months ago, more thorough than usual after the shooting. The cardiologist found markers in my blood work that indicate the defect is active in me. I've managed it. There are interventions, medications. The progression can be slowed, but the genetic profile is… the probability that Lily carries it is significant. The color in Sarah's face changed. She needs to be screened, he said quietly. Not urgently, the window is several years, but it needs to happen. It needs to be monitored. If it's present and it's caught early, it's manageable. If it isn't caught, stop. Her voice came out rough. How long have you known about this? The family history? My entire life? The specific risk to her specifically? 3 years. Sarah's hands had stopped moving around the tea mug. They were very still now. 3 years, she repeated. I know. You knew for 3 years that my daughter might have a heart condition inherited from your family, and you, her voice broke just at the end, just slightly. She pressed her lips together. And you stayed away. I thought, don't. Her voice was quiet now, which was worse than if it had been loud. Don't tell me what you thought. I need a minute. He gave her the minute. He gave her several of them. He sat across from her and did not try to fill the silence, and did not offer justifications, and did not make the mistake of reaching across the table, which he wanted to do, which was not something he was entitled to do. When she finally spoke again, her voice was contained, deliberate. You said you had a reason for coming to me now, after the shooting. Yes. Tell me. I'm dying, he said simply. Not immediately. The timeline is uncertain, the doctors hedge carefully, but the short version is that the cardiac situation is more advanced than they'd like, and the stress of my life has not been compatible with managing it. I could have another 10 years if I make significant changes. I could have less if I don't. I don't have confidence in my ability to make the required changes while remaining in my current position. She was watching him steadily. I have been, for the past 4 months, in the process of transferring significant portions of my business interests, the legitimate ones, to a structure that doesn't require my daily involvement. The other elements of my operation I'm stepping back. It's a complicated process. There are people who don't want me to do it. And the situation has become, he paused. The shooting was not random. Someone in your organization. Possibly. I don't have confirmation yet. He watched her take this in. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the environment. And because I need you to understand why I came to you now, after 3 years, when I have been very disciplined about staying away. It's not because the situation is safe. It isn't. What it is time. I'm running low on time and I can't. He stopped again. The word can't sat there between them. I can't keep watching from a distance, he said finally. I can't keep knowing she exists and not. I can't. That's not a justification. It's just what's true. Sarah picked up her tea mug. She drank from it. She set it back down and looked at the table and then looked at him. She drew a picture of you, she said, 2 months ago. She's never met you. She has no idea what you look like. She draws this tall man with dark hair, and she calls him Daddy, every single time. She exhaled slowly. She has 17 of them on her bedroom wall. I counted. Something happened in his chest that was not the cardiac condition. She's a happy kid, Sarah continued. She's funny and she's stubborn, and she has a very strong sense of justice about completely insane 3-year-old things, like whether her cup should be the green one or the blue one, and she sings all the time, constantly, just songs she makes up, little narrations about what she's doing. She's a very good kid. Her voice caught once, smoothed out. And she deserves a father. She deserves more than I've been able to give her alone. He did not move. I'm not forgiving you, Sarah said. I need to be very clear about that. I'm not there. I don't know if I'll get there. What happened? What you did? The way you left without? The way you decided our future? She stopped, steadied herself. That was a profound violation of trust, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend it wasn't. I'm not asking you to. But I can't make this decision based on what I feel about you. I have to make it based on what's right for her. She looked at him directly. And I think you should meet her. The air in the room changed. Not now, not without. I need to think about how to do this. She's 3. She's very literal. I need to prepare her. I need to. She shook her head. But I think you should meet her. I think she deserves to know who her father is. And I think. Her voice dropped slightly. I think if something happens to you and she finds out later that you were there, that you were close, and that I kept her away, I can't live with that. He nodded once. This isn't trust, she said. I want you to understand that. This is a provisional decision under difficult circumstances. And if you give me any reason at all, to question your commitment to her safety over your own interests, I will take her and disappear, and this time you will not find us. I understand. Do you? Yes. He met her eyes. I swear on whatever you think I'm capable of swearing on. A silence. Then, unexpectedly, Something in her expression shifted. Not warmth, not quite, but something that had been rigid became very slightly less rigid, the way an arm held too tight for too long will tremble slightly when the tension finally releases. She likes strawberries, Sarah said. In case you're wondering, she's obsessed with them, also with a very specific purple stuffed rabbit that is falling apart. And I am terrified of the day it finally disintegrates entirely because I don't think anything will replace it. He absorbed this. He stored it the way he stored information that mattered, completely, precisely, in a place he would not lose it. "What's the rabbit's name?" he asked. For the first time, a real smile crossed Sarah's face. Small, contained, but there. "Mr. Ears," she said, because she was very literal at 2. "I see. He only has one ear now. She says it's fine. She can hear twice as good with one ear. She told me very seriously that that's how it works." He looked at his coffee. "She's wrong about the biology. I know, I didn't correct her. Some fights you choose not to have." The morning light came through the window, and for a moment neither of them spoke. And it was almost not comfortable, not that. They had too much history for comfort, too much weight. But it was something adjacent to bearable. Something that contained, distantly, the shape of what it might eventually become if they were very careful and very lucky, and if he didn't do anything catastrophic, which was not, he acknowledged to himself, a certainty. His phone buzzed once. He glanced at it. "Adrian. Call when you can. Situation re. Thursday meeting." He put the phone face down on the table without responding. Sarah noticed. Something in her expression acknowledged it, the fact that he had made that choice, however small. She didn't say anything. She simply finished her tea and began to put her coat back on, and he understood the meeting was ending. "I'll contact you," she said. "Through the same channel. Don't call me. Just wait." "Okay." She stood. She picked up her bag. She looked at him one more time, and he could see all of it in her face. The damage, and the exhaustion, and the something else that had survived 3 years of deliberate burial that apparently could not be fully killed. "Luca," she said. "Yes. Don't make me regret this." She walked out. He sat alone in the coffee shop on 54th Street with his phone face down and his coffee cold, and 3 years of distance collapsing into something that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of an ending, or possibly, against all reasonable expectation, the beginning of something else entirely. He reached for his phone. Not to call Adrian. He typed a single search: early screening cardiac defects children. The results came back and he read them carefully, one by one, and took the kind of notes that people take when they are very serious about not making the same mistake twice. It was only later that afternoon back at the townhouse, going through the financial documents that Adrian had left on his desk, that he noticed something he'd been too preoccupied to see clearly before. A discrepancy. Small enough to have been accidental. The kind of thing that, in his world, was never accidental. It threaded through 3 accounts, across a period of 8 months, connected to movement that pointed, with the specificity of something carefully designed to look like noise, toward a structure he recognized, toward a set of decisions he had not made, toward a name he had not authorized. He set the documents down on the desk very carefully. He picked up the phone. He called a number that was not Adrian's. "Pull everything you have," he said quietly, "on Marco Bellini. Everything. Not what I already have. New surveillance. I want to know where he's been for the last 6 months, who he's been talking to, and what he's moving." A pause on the other end. "Boss, Marco is—" "I know what Marco is," Luca said. "Do it anyway." He ended the call and stood at his desk and looked out at the city, and thought about the shooting 5 weeks ago, the car that had known his route, the timing that had been too precise for an amateur. He thought about the only person who would have known. And underneath the cold arithmetic of that realization, something colder still, the understanding that everything he had just set in motion, everything he had promised Sarah, everything that for the first time in 3 years felt like it might be possible, was happening precisely at the moment when the most dangerous person in his life had decided to move. His phone rang. Adrian, again. He answered it. "The Thursday meeting," Adrian said carefully. "Marco wants to move the location. Says the original venue has a security issue." Luca was quiet for a moment. "Tell him fine," he said. "Whatever he wants." He ended the call. He had spent 20 years learning that the most dangerous thing in any organization was not the enemy outside. It was the friend who had stopped being one. And somewhere across this city, his daughter was drawing pictures of a man she had never met, a man she had called Daddy, in a park while holding his hand without knowing what she was holding, and he was running out of time in more ways than one. The only question was which clock ran out first. The documents were still on his desk at 2 in the morning. Luca had not moved them. He had not moved much at all, which was its own kind of evidence. A man who spent his days in controlled motion, in the deliberate geography of power, sitting at a desk in the dark with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, staring at numbers that told a story he didn't want to believe. He spread them out again. 3 separate accounts, routed through 2 different shell companies, the paper trail thin enough to look like legitimate overhead but thick enough, if you knew what to look at, to resolve into something unmistakable. Money moving in the wrong direction, not large amounts. That was the craft of it, the patience of it. Small amounts, over 8 months, accumulating into a figure that represented not theft but investment. Someone had been buying something. He thought about the car that had known his route, the shooter who had been positioned at exactly the right angle for exactly the kind of man who knew that Luca always rode in the second vehicle. Never the first, always the second, because the first was the obvious target, and he had stopped being obvious 20 years ago. A detail that lived in precisely 3 people's knowledge: his driver, Adrian, and Marco. He thought about Marco's request to move Thursday's meeting. Security issue, Adrian had said. Marco had called it a security issue. He picked up the whiskey, set it back down without drinking. His phone sat on the corner of the desk. He had not called Marco. He would not call Marco, not yet, not until the new surveillance came back, not until he had something that wasn't inference and pattern recognition and 20 years of watching men betray each other for reasons that always came down to the same few things: money, fear, the particular resentment of someone who has stood behind another man's throne for so long that they have begun to mistake their proximity to power for an entitlement to it. He had known Marco Bellini for 19 years. They had been in rooms together where the temperature was the kind that required everyone present to either trust each other completely or be willing to die. And they had navigated those rooms together, and Luca had trusted the navigation. He had trusted it enough to give Marco access to things that no one else touched: scheduling, routing, the internal structure of operations that required absolute reliability. He thought about what it meant that he had given all of that to the man who might have tried to kill him. He closed the documents, put them in a drawer, locked it. Then he went upstairs and lay on his bed fully clothed and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep. Adrian arrived at 7:15, which was early even for him, and the look on his face when he came through the office door told Luca the surveillance had already turned something up. "Close the door," Luca said. Adrian closed it. He was a careful man by nature, compact, precise, economical in movement and expression in the way of someone who had grown up understanding that visible emotion was a liability. He had been with Luca for 11 years. He had never, in 11 years, looked the way he looked right now. "Talk," Luca said. "We pulled 6 months of movement on Marco." Adrian set a folder on the desk. 3 meetings we didn't know about. 2 in Jersey, 1 in a private room at a restaurant in Midtown. The restaurant is owned by a holding company that traces to, he paused, the Caruso family. Luca was quiet. "The Carusos," he said finally. "Yes. Marco has been meeting with Donnie Caruso. We don't have a confirmation it was Donnie personally. We have confirmation the venue is Caruso connected and that Marco attended 3 meetings there over a 5-month period." Luca picked up the folder. He looked at the photographs, grainy, taken from distance, the particular resolution of surveillance work done quickly. Marco's profile. A car he didn't recognize. The exterior of a midtown building with an awning in a color he couldn't quite make out in black and white. "The timing," he said. First meeting was 2 weeks before the assassination attempt. He set the folder down. He breathed in through his nose, slowly, the deliberate kind of breathing that his doctor had told him was essential and that he had been doing as a control mechanism for so long it predated any medical advice. Who knows about this? The 2 people who pulled the surveillance, both reliable. Both. Adrian stopped. Both what? "Both scared," Adrian said. "When they saw what they had, they were scared. I don't think they said that in those words, but that's what it was." Luca nodded slowly. "Get them out of the city for a while, somewhere comfortable. Say it's a security rotation." "Okay. And the Thursday meeting?" Marco's already confirmed the new venue, warehouse space in Long Island City. Says it's a neutral site with clean security, belonging to... Does it belong to anyone we know? A pause. We're checking. Check faster. He stood up from behind the desk. And get me a car, not the usual one. Different driver, different route. I need to make a stop this morning. Adrian's expression didn't change. The woman from the park? Luca looked at him. I'm not blind, Adrian said simply. And I'm not stupid. Do you want backup on the stop or... No, I want the car and the route and nobody else knowing where I am for 2 hours. Adrian nodded and left. Luca went to the window. The morning was low and gray, the kind of overcast that feels like the city is conserving something, pulling everything inward. He thought about Lily's 17 drawings on a bedroom wall he had never seen. He thought about a purple rabbit with one ear. He thought about Marco sitting in Sarah's kitchen 6 years ago, uninvited and deliberate, burning the only thing in Luca's life that had ever felt like it belonged to him rather than to the operation. He had told himself at the time that Marco had done it carelessly, out of poor judgment. He had believed that because the alternative, that Marco had done it with full understanding of what it would destroy, required him to have been wrong about someone for a very long time. And being wrong about people in his world was not an error you survived multiple times. But now the numbers on the paper and the photographs in the folder and the request to move Thursday's meeting all pointed to the same recalibration. The question was not whether Marco had done it deliberately. The question was how far back the deliberateness went, and what exactly Marco had been building during all the years when Luca had believed he was building it with him. Sarah's building was a walk-up on a tree-lined street in Park Slope that was clearly in the process of becoming more expensive than it had been when she moved in. New coffee place on the corner, scaffolding on the building across the street. The specific transitional texture of a neighborhood that used to belong to people like her and was beginning to belong to people like his legitimate business partners. He rang the buzzer at 9 a.m. and waited. Silence for long enough that he thought she wasn't home. Then the intercom crackled. Who is it? Her voice, flat and cautious. It's me. A pause. I said I'd contact you. I know, I need to talk to you about something that can't wait. Another pause, longer. He could hear, very faintly, a child's voice in the background. Not words, just the melody of ongoing commentary that small children provide to their own experience. The door buzzed open. He climbed 3 flights of stairs. She was standing in the doorway of the apartment, one hand on the door frame, blocking the entrance without quite closing it. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweater and her hair was damp, and she looked like someone who had been up for several hours already. The controlled alertness of a person whose morning started with someone else's schedule. Behind her, in the main room, he could see the corner of a small table with a cereal bowl on it. Lily's here, Sarah said. It was both information and warning. I know. I won't. I'm not asking to. I just need 5 minutes. She looked at him. She stepped back from the doorway. He came in. The apartment was small, organized with the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to make limited space work hard. Books on every available surface. A children's art corner with the deliberate chaos of someone very small who had been given full permission to express herself. On the wall beside the hallway, he saw it immediately, couldn't not, a collection of drawings in crayon and marker, 17 of them, each one featuring variations on the same tall, dark figure. He made himself look away. From the main room, a small voice. Mama, my spoon fell. I'll get it in a second, Bug. Sarah didn't raise her voice, just projected it in the direction of the room, then looked back at him. 5 minutes. Kitchen. The kitchen was barely big enough for 2 adults standing still. She leaned against the counter with her arms crossed and looked at him with the expression of someone who had already identified 3 possible versions of this conversation and was preparing for the worst. The situation has changed, he said quietly. What does that mean? It means I have reason to believe the attempt on my life was organized by someone inside my operation. Someone with enough access to my schedule and routing to have planned it precisely. Her face didn't move. How close inside? Very close. How does this affect... She stopped. Restarted. How does this affect us? Us. The word sat in the small kitchen and did something to the temperature. It means the timeline I described yesterday. The restructuring, the stepping back. is more complicated than I indicated. There's a possibility that the same person who organized the attempt is aware that I'm trying to exit and is accelerating their own plans in response. In response to what specifically? In response to the belief that a man who wants to leave can be more easily removed than one who intends to stay. She breathed in, breathed out. Her jaw was set tight. You came here because you're scared. I came here because you need to know the environment has changed and there are precautions. You came here, she said again, because you're scared. Not for yourself. Say what you mean. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen doorway, the sound of a small person climbing down from a chair. Yes, he said. What kind of precautions? I want to move your building security to a higher tier. The current arrangement is adequate for most scenarios, but if this escalates, no. She said it immediately, without pause. Sarah, no. You don't get to install more invisible infrastructure in my life without my knowledge, which is apparently what the current arrangement already is, and now you want to… Her voice dropped sharply. No. Then tell me what you'll accept. I'll accept you fixing your own situation so that my daughter isn't in danger because of who her father is. Her voice was a blade, controlled and precise. I'll accept you doing whatever it is you do to handle this, and I'll accept you not bringing it to my door. I'm trying to protect… I know you're trying to protect us, she said, and there was something exhausted in it, something that had run out of room. You've been trying to protect us for 3 years, from a distance, invisibly. And now you're standing in my kitchen telling me the protection might not be working, which means your system of protecting us while also not being present for us has failed in exactly the way I could have predicted if you'd ever asked me. Footsteps in the hallway, small ones. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in a yellow shirt with a dinosaur on it, her dark curls chaotic from sleep, holding an empty cereal bowl with both hands with the air of someone delivering a very important object. She looked at Luca. Luca looked at her. She had never seen him before. Not consciously, not in a context where she could make a connection. But children that age run on frequencies that adults have mostly stopped being able to hear. And she looked at him with those blue-gray eyes for a full 3 seconds of unblinking assessment. Then she held out the bowl toward him. All gone, she announced. He took the bowl from her because there was no other possible response to that. All gone, he confirmed. She seemed satisfied by this verification. She turned around and walked back toward the main room, bare feet on the kitchen tile. Sarah let out a breath that was almost a laugh, and almost something else. She does that, she said quietly. Just accepts people. No self-preservation instinct whatsoever. She paused. She has no idea who you are. I know. But she'll figure it out. Kids that age are… She notices everything. If you keep appearing, she's going to start connecting things, and I need to manage how that happens. I understand. Do you? She looked at him steadily. Because understanding would have looked like you telling me about the cardiac condition 3 years ago. Understanding would have looked like giving me the choice rather than making it for me. Understanding is not a thing you've demonstrated a consistent capacity for where I'm concerned. He had no argument to offer. I'll handle the internal situation, he said. I need you to tell me if you see anything unusual. Anyone who doesn't belong on your block. Any vehicle that feels wrong. Anyone who asks questions about you or about Lily. You want me to be a lookout. I want you to tell me if something feels wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. And then what? I call you and you send men with guns, and my daughter grows up knowing her father is the reason her apartment building sometimes has men outside it? Better that than the alternative. Is it? Her voice was very quiet. Is it actually better, Luca? Or does it just feel better to you because doing something, anything, is less unbearable than doing nothing? He didn't answer. She turned toward the window above the sink, looked out at the narrow strip of gray sky visible between buildings. I'm going to ask you to leave now. I need to think, and I can't think with you standing in my kitchen. Okay. I'll contact you, the same channel. Give me a few days. Okay, he said again. He set the cereal bowl on the counter. He walked toward the hallway. From the main room, Mama, can I have more milk? In a second, Bug. He passed the wall of drawings without stopping, but he felt them anyway. 17 versions of a man she had never met. A father assembled entirely from imagination and the particular hope that small children carry like it's a physical organ, something they were simply born with. He went down the 3 flights of stairs and out into the gray morning. Whoa. The car was waiting on the corner. He got in and sat in the back and said nothing for the first 10 minutes of the drive. Then, Adrian. Adrian was in the passenger seat. He turned halfway. The Thursday meeting. I'm going. A pause. Boss, I'm going. We handle it the way we handle anything. I arrive informed. I control the room. I give Marco nothing he can use. If he's already made arrangements at the venue, then I need to know what those arrangements look like before I walk in. He looked out the window at the passing street. Get me the floor plan of the warehouse. Entry points, exits, structural specifics. And I want 2 of our people already inside before I arrive. Maintenance, delivery. I don't care the pretext. Adrian turned fully back to the front and made a call, quiet and clipped. Luca's phone buzzed. A message from a number he'd been waiting on. The financial analyst he kept separate from the main operation. A man who appeared in no organizational chart, who communicated only in encrypted text. Third account traces to holding company registered 14 months ago. Director of record is a nominee. Beneficial owner registration references an attorney whose other clients include 2 known Caruso entities. Not a coincidence. 14 months ago. Not 8. 14. He had been shot 5 weeks ago. The accounts had been moving for 8 months. The company that was funding whatever Marco was building had been established 14 months before that. He did backward arithmetic. 19 months of parallel planning, while sitting across from him in meetings, while advising him on operations, while standing at his shoulder during negotiations where Luca's strength had depended entirely on the belief that everyone in the room was aligned. 19 months. He typed back a single word. Continue. He put the phone in his pocket. He watched Brooklyn become Queens through the car window, the familiar grammar of the outer boroughs, the bodega and the warehouse and the auto shop and the narrow street, the city that had no interest in anyone's private arithmetic. He thought about 19 months. He thought about what could be built in 19 months by a man who had access to everything, who knew every pressure point, every weakness, every person Luca cared about or could be made to care about. And then something cold moved through him, something that was not the cardiac condition, and not the cold weather, and not even fear exactly, because fear was an emotion, and this was a calculation. The specific, involuntary math of a man who has just understood that someone has been several moves ahead of him for longer than he thought. If Marco knew everything, if the access had been that deep, that long, then Marco knew about Sarah. He had always known about Sarah. He'd been the one who'd burned it 6 years ago. He had never stopped knowing. He had watched Luca watch them from a distance for 3 years, and he had watched Luca nearly die 5 weeks ago, and he had watched Luca reach for the first time back toward the woman and the child. And Marco was a man who understood leverage. He hit Adrian's shoulder. Change of plans. Take me back to Park Slope. Adrian turned. What? Now. Take me back now. The car swung into a turn. Luca had his phone out already, pulling up the channel Sarah didn't know he'd established for exactly this kind of emergency. The one that went to a secure line she didn't have yet because he hadn't given it to her, because he'd believed he had more time. She didn't answer. He tried again. The phone rang 4 times and clicked to voicemail. Her voice, brief and practical, the message of someone who didn't have time for elaborate recordings. And he ended the call and tried the apartment intercom number, which rang 7 times. She could just be busy, Adrian said. She answers her phone. Luca's voice came out flat. She has a 3-year-old. She always answers her phone. He called a 3rd time. On the 2nd ring, the call connected. Not Sarah's voice. A man's voice, low and almost apologetic, the register of someone performing casualness very carefully. Mr. Moretti, I was wondering when you'd call. The car was still moving through Queens traffic. He made himself breathe. Marco, he said. She's fine, Marco said. The little girl is fine. I want you to know that because I need you thinking clearly, and you won't if you're picturing worst-case scenarios. A pause, and in the background, nothing. No ambient noise, somewhere sound-controlled. I think it's time we had an honest conversation, don't you? The car had stopped at a light. Luca looked at the red signal through the windshield, the automatic red, the light that meant stop and offered no negotiation. Where? He said. I'll send an address. Come alone. And I mean genuinely alone, not the version of alone you offered Sarah this morning. I know the difference. Another pause. And Luca, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I've been planning this for a long time. There's no version where you win by force. The call ended. He sat with the phone in his hand for 3 seconds, and then he did the thing he had spent 20 years training himself to do when everything else failed. He became very still, very cold, the particular stillness of a man who has run out of intermediate options and has arrived at the only clear choice remaining, which was that he would walk into whatever room Marco Bellini had chosen, completely aware it was a trap, and he would do it because the alternative was the unthinkable. Because the one thing Marco had miscalculated was that Luca was no longer a man who measured risk against power. He was a man who measured it against a little girl in a yellow dinosaur shirt who had handed him an empty cereal bowl like it was a gift. Turn around, he told Adrian quietly. Adrian was already turning. The address came through 4 minutes after Marco ended the call. A warehouse in Red Hook, down near the water, the kind of industrial block that smelled like salt and rust, and the particular indifference of the harbor. Luca knew the area. He had done business there years ago, before the neighborhood started accumulating art galleries and overpriced cocktail bars in its periphery, back when it was purely functional, loading docks and cold storage, and the kind of square footage that absorbed sound and asked no questions. He had Adrian drop him 2 blocks away. "This is wrong," Adrian said, for the 3rd time. His voice had the controlled tension of a man who has run out of ways to say don't do this, and is now simply saying it more quietly. "I know. Let me at least know." Luca checked his jacket. The piece at his hip was there, which was comfort of a limited kind given that walking into a prepared position with a single firearm was theater more than strategy. "If I'm not out in 90 minutes, call Reyes, tell him everything. He'll know what to do with it." Reyes is going to want authorization from, "Tell him I said the word is cardinal." He opened the car door. The harbor air came in cold and direct. "He'll move." Luca. Adrian never used his name. The use of it now was its own kind of statement. "Watch the channel," Luca said. "If Sarah tries to reach me, you answer it. You tell her—" He stopped, considered. "Tell her to stay inside. Tell her I'm handling it." He got out of the car. The walk was 2 blocks of cracked pavement and chain link and a seagull sitting on top of a no parking sign with the absolute indifference of something that has never needed to care about human arrangements. He walked at his normal pace. Running communicated panic, and panic communicated weakness, and he could not afford to arrive at whatever was waiting for him as anything other than the specific version of himself that had controlled rooms for 20 years. He found the building, a loading dock entrance, roll-up door halfway open, the interior beyond it dark enough that his eyes needed a moment to adjust. He stepped inside. The space was maybe 4,000 square feet of concrete floor and steel beam ceiling, and the faint ghost of whatever had been stored here recently. Something chemical, industrial, not quite masked by the cold air moving through the gaps in the roof panels. 3 fluorescent lights were on, positioned in a triangle that illuminated the center of the space and left the edges dark. Under the lights, 2 folding chairs facing each other across a cheap table with a water bottle on it, the staging of something that wanted to look like a conversation. Marco Bellini was standing to the left of the table, not sitting, which told Luca he was nervous or had decided standing gave him an advantage, or both. He was wearing a dark coat and his hands were in his pockets, and he looked— Luca registered this with the particular attention he gave to faces in high-stakes rooms. He looked tired. Not the tired of one bad night, the tired of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had almost reached the place where they were going to be able to put it down. 2 other men were visible in the shadows. Probably more that weren't. "You came alone," Marco said. He sounded mildly surprised. "You asked me to." "I did." Marco pulled his right hand from his pocket. Empty. A gesture of demonstration, not quite goodwill. "Sit down, Luca." "Where is she?" "She's fine, I told you." "Where?" Marco held his gaze for a moment, then tilted his head toward a door at the far end of the space. A standard interior door, wooden, incongruous in the industrial setting. "In there, with Lily. There's a woman with them, a professional. They're not being— Nothing has happened to them. This is not that kind of situation." Luca looked at the door. He made himself look away from it, back to Marco, because looking at the door too long told Marco something he didn't need to know. He sat down. Marco sat across from him. He picked up the water bottle, looked at it, set it back down without opening it. A fidget. Marco Bellini did not fidget. Luca had watched him sit through interrogations, through negotiations with men who had guns on the table, through the aftermath of disasters that would have broken most people, and he had never once seen Marco fidget. He filed that away. "How long?" Luca said. Marco looked up. "How long what?" "How long have you been building this?" A pause. Something moved through Marco's face, not guilt, not exactly. Something more complicated. Something that had been practiced for so long, it had almost become its own kind of sincerity. The Caruso connection? 14 months, the longer architecture, he paused again, longer than that. How much longer? Marco tilted his head slightly. 4 years. Luca heard the number. He did not move. 4 years, he said. Yes. You started building this 4 years ago. I started planning 4 years ago. Building took longer to begin. Marco's voice was even, the voice of a man delivering a briefing, the voice Luca had heard 10,000 times in operational contexts. The Caruso introduction was the last piece. Everything before that was internal. Luca thought about 4 years ago. 4 years ago, he ran the calendar backward with the precision of a man whose memory was one of his few indisputably reliable assets. 4 years ago, he had survived a complication with a rival territory that had required 18 months of careful maneuvering and had come out the other side, having consolidated 3 blocks of the port operation. Marco had been central to that consolidation. Marco had been, in the specific language of Luca's world, essential. While you were helping me consolidate the port, Luca said. Yes. You were already planning to take it. To take all of it, Marco said. Not apologetically. Precisely. The port was one piece. I was planning the whole structure. Something in Luca's chest shifted, the scar tissue pulling slightly as he straightened in the chair. He breathed through it. Tell me why. Marco looked at him for a long moment. You want the real answer, or the one you'll find satisfying? I want the one that's true. The one that's true, Marco said, is that I have spent 19 years being the most important person in the room who nobody in the room acknowledged. I built more of what you have than you know. I covered for you during the years when the cardiac situation was affecting your judgment, and you didn't know it yet. I managed the Santoro situation entirely on my own, and handed you the resolution and watched you accept the credit from the table because that's how the structure worked. Everything flows up. Every success becomes yours. Every calculation I made, every relationship I built, every problem I solved before it reached your desk became part of the Moretti Empire. My work. Your name. Luca said nothing. I'm not saying you're incompetent, Marco continued. You're not. You're very good at what you do, but what you're good at is the part that people see. The room, the presence, the final decision. What I'm good at is everything that makes that room possible, and I have been invisible in it for 19 years. You had authority. I had authority that derived from you, that ended the moment you decided it ended. That was always, every day, contingent on your continued confidence in me. That is not authority, Luca. That is permission. His voice remained level, controlled. I am 51 years old. I have given 20 years of my life to an enterprise that will never have my name on it, to a position that exists only as long as you choose to let it exist. And I decided 4 years ago that I was done choosing that. Luca looked at him across the cheap table and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had just had a very familiar argument from an angle he'd never considered, that Marco Bellini was not wrong about any of the things he had just described. That did not make the rest of it acceptable. The shooting, Luca said. A pause. Yes. You arranged it. I arranged the opportunity. The specifics were Caruso's implementation. A very slight shift in Marco's jaw. The first thing that was not perfectly controlled. It was supposed to be cleaner than it was. Cleaner. You weren't supposed to survive it. He said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and has simply never been spoken aloud. The plan was not for this conversation. The plan was for your absence to create a transition window during which the restructuring I've been preparing would... And Sarah. Luca's voice had gone very quiet. The specific quiet of something that has stopped performing control and simply arrived at it. You went to her apartment 6 years ago. Marco was still. That wasn't poor judgment, Luca said. Was it? A long pause. No. You went deliberately. You burned it deliberately. You were changing, Marco said, and for the first time something sharpened in his voice that wasn't control, that was actual feeling underneath the architecture. You were spending half your time in Brooklyn with a waitress, and you were making decisions you were distracted. You were starting to calculate differently. I could see it in every meeting. I told myself it was temporary, that the pattern would break on its own, and when it didn't, you broke it. Yes. The word landed in the cold space between them and sat there. Luca breathed in, breathed out. He looked at his hands on the table, at the particular stillness he had trained them to. The hands that didn't shake, that didn't curl, that maintained the external grammar of a man who had processed what he'd heard and had not been broken by it. He had been right about all of it. Every inference from the documents, every pattern from the surveillance, every piece of the 19-month arithmetic. He had been right, and there was absolutely nothing satisfying about that. She had my daughter, he said. I didn't know she was pregnant, Marco said. That information came later. That was not part of the calculation. Does that make it better? No, it's simply true. Luca looked at him. And now, you have them in a room. What is it you think happens next? Marco leaned forward slightly. What happens next is you transfer operational authority to me. Formal, documented, the kind that holds legally under the structures we've been using. You step back, which you were already planning to do, so this is not a significant change in your personal situation. You keep the legitimate businesses. You get the health outcomes you're apparently trying to achieve. He paused, and something careful came into his voice. You get the woman and the child, Luca. That's not a threat. That's the offer. You are already leaving this world. Leave it. Let me have what I've been building toward and take what you actually want. Luca looked at him for a long moment. And if I say no, then the situation becomes more complicated and I'd prefer it didn't. What does more complicated mean specifically? It means the Carusos have a different approach than I do, and I have limited ability to... Marco stopped. Something crossed his face that was almost, for a fraction of a second, something like discomfort. Donnie Caruso is not a man who leaves exit ramps. I have been, in this negotiation, the more moderate voice. That is the truth. If this conversation fails, the next one won't involve me. You're telling me to be grateful you haven't had them killed yet. I'm telling you the geometry of the situation. Luca sat very still and thought about geometry. He thought about the door at the far end of the warehouse and what was behind it. He thought about the two visible men in the shadows and the indeterminate number of invisible ones. He thought about Adrian 2 blocks away watching a channel that Sarah wasn't using because Sarah's phone was presumably now in Marco's possession, or turned off. And he thought about Reyes and the word cardinal and the 90-minute window that had maybe 60 minutes left in it. He thought about what Marco had not said, which was more useful than what he had. Marco had not said the Carusos were here. He'd said Donnie Caruso has a different approach. Future tense, conditional. Which meant the Caruso element was still external, still a threat being held in reserve rather than a presence in the room. Which meant Marco was still, at this precise moment, the controlling variable. Which meant the two men in the shadows answered to Marco, not to anyone Luca didn't know. He thought about the fidgeting with the water bottle. He thought about it was supposed to be cleaner than it was. Marco had not wanted him in a room. Marco had wanted him in a box. This conversation was not Plan A. This conversation was what happened when Plan A produced the wrong outcome, when the man you needed to be dead turned out to be still alive and still in possession of information that could dismantle what you'd built, and the only remaining option was to convert the asset rather than eliminate it. Marco needed his signature. That was what this was. The documented transfer of authority that held legally. Those were the operative words. Marco had built something that required Luca's formal cooperation because he had built it within the legal structures that Luca had spent years constructing for exactly the purpose of insulating the operation from external challenge, and those structures now required the one thing that couldn't be forged or compelled from a dead man with the same reliability as from a living one. He needed Luca to choose. I need to see them, Luca said. Marco was quiet for a moment. That's not part of the... I'm not signing anything without seeing that they're unharmed. That's not a negotiating position. That's the only condition under which this conversation continues. He held Marco's gaze. You want my signature. You need it to mean something, legally, which means you need me coherent and present and not operating from fear. Show me they're okay, and I'll listen to your terms. A long silence. Marco stood up. He walked into the door at the end of the space and knocked twice, a pattern, deliberate, and opened it. Luca stood. The room beyond the door was smaller, lit by a single floor lamp that someone had brought in, a domestic object absurd in the industrial setting. Sarah was sitting in a folding chair against the far wall with Lily in her lap, Lily asleep with her cheek against her mother's collarbone, and her dark curls covering most of her face. A woman Luca didn't recognize stood near the door. Late 30s, professional stillness, the posture of someone who has done this before and is not emotionally engaged with the current assignment. Sarah looked up when the door opened. Her eyes went to Luca, and something moved in them that was not relief exactly. It was more complicated than relief, layered with things that had been building for hours in a small room with no information. She was holding it together. He could see the cost of that in the set of her shoulders, the careful way she was breathing, the grip she maintained on Lily that was firm but not panicked. She was keeping it together for the child, the way parents keep things together when the alternative is terrifying a person too small to carry the weight of adult fear. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." Her voice was even. "She's sleeping. She doesn't know. I told her we were visiting. She doesn't know." He looked at her for 3 seconds. He tried to put into those 3 seconds what he couldn't say in front of Marco and the woman and the shadows. "I see you. I know what this is costing you. I am not leaving this building without you." She looked back at him, and he didn't know if she received any of that or simply saw a man in a dark coat standing in a doorway, the same man she had sent away from her kitchen 2 hours ago because she needed space to think. He turned back to Marco. "Close the door," he said. Marco closed it. They walked back to the table. Luca sat down. He picked up the water bottle that Marco hadn't opened and cracked the seal and drank, because his mouth was dry and because performing calm was now a survival mechanism rather than a professional habit. "The documents," he said. Let me see what you want me to sign." Marco reached into his coat and produced a folded set of papers, maybe 12 pages, and set them on the table. Luca pulled them toward him and began to read. He read slowly. Marco waited with the particular patience of a man who had been waiting for 4 years and could wait another 30 minutes. The two men in the shadows didn't move. The documents were thorough. Luca's attorney would have called them a masterpiece of legal construction, which was a bitter thing to notice given that his attorney had almost certainly drafted significant portions of the shell structures being appropriated. The transfer of operational authority was embedded in language about health-related business continuity planning that was technically accurate and completely obscured the reality of what was being transferred. It was the work of years. It was meticulous, and it was devastating, and reading it was the specific experience of watching someone hand you a detailed map of how they had been walking through your house for years without your knowledge. He turned to page 7 and stopped. He read the clause twice. It was a single paragraph, nested inside a section about retained interest in legitimate business holdings. Standard language at first read, the kind of boilerplate about named beneficiaries and succession of interest that appeared in every estate and business continuity document Luca had ever dealt with. Except the named beneficiary was not Sarah Bennett. The named beneficiary, in the event of Luca Moretti's death within 36 months of the signing of this document, was Marco Bellini acting as trustee for the Moretti Family Trust, which meant that the document Marco wanted him to sign did not simply transfer operational authority. It transferred everything. The legitimate businesses, the foundations, the financial structures he had spent years building as a clean exit. All of it would rout, upon his death, through Marco's control. The document was not a negotiation. It was a mechanism. A legal mechanism designed to make his death, at any point in the following 3 years, a financial event that benefited Marco Bellini rather than his daughter. He set the papers down. He looked at Marco. Marco was watching him with the expression of a man who has just watched someone find the thing he put there for them to find and is now recalibrating how fast to move. "The beneficiary clause," Luca said. Marco said nothing. This doesn't protect my daughter, Luca said. This is written so that my death is useful to you for the next 3 years. Marco's jaw moved slightly. The clause is standard. Don't. His voice came out flat and absolute. Don't insult my intelligence at this specific moment. You have had 19 years to observe the precise limits of my patience. You know where they are. A silence. You are never going to let me walk out of this, Luca said. Marco's expression shifted, not to guilt, to something that was almost, it took Luca a moment to place it, something that was almost relief. The relief of a man who has been performing a version of this conversation and is now being permitted to stop performing. The Carusos need the Moretti name gone, Marco said quietly. Not just the operations, the name, the identity. A transfer of authority doesn't accomplish that if you're still alive and still connected to legitimate structures that give you standing to challenge it. I tried to. The original plan was cleaner. This, he gestured at the table, the papers, the warehouse around them. This is a complication. I'm a complication, Luca said. Yes. I'm a complication you're going to resolve after I sign. Marco did not answer. Luca put his hands flat on the table. He felt the cold surface under his palms, the specific texture of the cheap folding table, the absolute solidity of it, the physical reality of a room he was in, with a man who had just confirmed what the beneficiary clause had already told him, that this building was where Marco Bellini intended his story to end. And in the room behind the door, his daughter was sleeping against her mother's shoulder, dreaming whatever 3-year-olds dream, unaware that her father was sitting at a folding table working through the arithmetic of how many minutes he had left to change the outcome. He looked at Marco across the table, at the man he had trusted for 19 years, at the face he had read 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms, and apparently never read correctly, and he understood with complete and terrible clarity that the old version of himself, the one who calculated everything in terms of power and leverage and the most favorable outcome for the operation, was not the version of himself who was going to get his daughter out of this building. The old Luca would have looked for the angle, would have bought time with the signature, waited for Adrian's window, played the room from the inside. But Marco knew the old Luca, had studied him for 19 years, had built this entire architecture specifically around the patterns of how the old Luca thought and moved and calculated. Whatever happened next had to come from somewhere Marco hadn't studied. He picked up the pen that had been placed, with quiet presumption, beside the stack of papers. He turned to the signature page, and he looked up at Marco Bellini and said, in a voice so quiet that the two men in the shadows would not have been able to hear it, "I know you sent her the roses." Marco went very still. "The ones on her birthday," Luca said. 3 years ago. First year she was gone. White roses, no card, delivered to an address that the protection arrangement shouldn't have been able to access. I thought at the time it was a mistake in the routing. I filed it away. He held Marco's gaze. "You sent them. To remind her that someone knew where she was, that it could reach her." Marco's expression had not changed, but his breathing had, barely, just slightly, a shift in the rhythm that Luca knew because he knew this man's breathing better than he knew almost anyone's. "You've been frightening her for 3 years, Luca said. Not enough to run, just enough to stay frightened. Just enough to make sure she never felt safe enough to come back to me on her own. You needed to control when that happened." Marco said nothing. "Because you couldn't build what you were building if I had them," Luca said. "If I had them, I would have changed. You knew that. You saw it happening 6 years ago, and you stopped it, and you spent 3 years making sure it stayed stopped." He set the pen down. "You weren't afraid of my losing focus. You were afraid of what I'd become if I stopped being alone." The warehouse was very quiet. "Sign the papers, Luca," Marco said. "No," Luca said. And in the moment before everything in the room changed, before Marco's hand moved toward his coat, and the two men in the shadows began to move, and the sound of the harbor outside continued with complete indifference to what was happening inside, Luca Moretti made the only calculation that mattered. He was not signing those papers, he was not dying in this building, and he was not leaving without the woman and the child behind that door. Not because he was the most feared man in New York, not because he had survived 20 years of a world that ate people like him, but because a little girl with his eyes had handed him an empty cereal bowl and trusted him to know what to do with it, and he was for the first time in his life going to deserve that trust or he was going to die trying. He threw the table, The table went over with a sound like a gunshot. It bought him exactly 2 seconds. The men in the shadows flinched at the noise, and Marco's hand hadn't cleared his coat yet. And Luca used both seconds completely, crossing the distance to the nearer of the two men with the specific economy of someone who has done this before and knows that hesitation is the thing that kills you, not the other guy. He hit the man once, very hard, in the throat. The man went down, producing a sound like a drain backing up, both hands at his neck, and Luca had his weapon before he hit the concrete. The second man was faster. He'd cleared his piece and was bringing it up, and Luca dropped low and moved left, and the shot went wide and loud in the enclosed space. And then Luca was inside his arm, and the gun was pointed at the ceiling, and the second man was struggling with the physics of his own leverage, which were bad. And Luca drove an elbow into his face and felt the cartilage of a nose rearrange itself, and the man sat down. He came up with both weapons, and Marco was across the space, behind an overturned equipment crate, his own gun out and pointed. They looked at each other across 15 feet of concrete floor, both breathing hard, both with somewhere to point. "You just made this very difficult," Marco said. "You were going to kill me after I signed," Luca said. "I made it accurate." "The Carusos are outside," Marco said. "2 vehicles. They're monitoring the time window. If I don't send a signal in—" He glanced at something on his wrist. 11 minutes. They come in." "Then we have 11 minutes," Luca said. "You can't shoot your way out of 2 vehicles of Caruso people with 2 guns." "I know. So what exactly is your plan here?" Luca didn't answer that because his plan, to the extent that a plan was the right word for the particular improvised forward motion he was currently engaged in, depended entirely on a 60-minute window and a man named Reyes who had received a word through Adrian and either had or hadn't moved on it, and Luca had no way to know which. He was operating on probability and on the specific faith of a man who had built reliable systems and was now betting his life that they had held. "The door," he said, keeping the weapon on Marco and moving sideways toward the interior door. "You're going to tell whoever is in that room to open it. And then what? You walk out of here with a woman and a 3-year-old and just tell them to open the door, Marco." Marco looked at him. He was calculating. Luca could see it. The same calculus he'd watched Marco perform for 19 years across 100 different situations. The assessment of variables and outcomes. But the calculation had a different texture now. Something was off in it. Something in Marco's positioning behind the crate was not the positioning of a man who was confident in his next move. "Tell me something," Marco said, and his voice had shifted slightly. The briefing tone was gone, something more unguarded underneath it. "If the positions were reversed, if you'd been where I was for 19 years, what would you have done?" "I'd have told you," Luca said. "And if I hadn't listened? Then I'd have left, found something of my own." "Easy to say." "Maybe." He kept the weapon level. "Maybe it is. Tell the woman to open the door." A long silence. The concrete floor. The sound of the harbor through the gaps in the roof panels. The first man Luca had hit was still down, his breathing ragged and rhythmic. The second was conscious and staying very deliberately still, his face producing blood that dripped from his chin to the floor with a metronomic regularity. Marco lowered his gun 2 inches. Not a surrender. A gesture. "You know what the worst part is?" His voice was quiet now. "I don't think you would have listened. You never tried." "I did. Once. Years ago. I told you I thought the structure was— I used different words, but I told you I thought the distribution of credit and authority wasn't. And you looked at me like I'd said something in a language you didn't speak." Luca thought about it. He could not, in this moment, retrieve a specific memory to match that description, which was itself an answer to the question Marco wasn't asking. "I'm sorry," Luca said. Marco blinked. "Not for tonight. Not for this. But for what I didn't see. For what was true in what you said." He moved another step toward the interior door. "It doesn't change what you did, but I can hold both things at the same time." Marco's gun hand dropped another inch. From somewhere outside, muffled by distance and the building's walls, but unmistakable to anyone who knew the specific acoustic signature, the sound of vehicles. Not arriving. Moving. The particular sound of an organized approach. Marco's head turned sharply. "That's not the Carusos," Luca said. Marco looked back at him. 11 minutes, Luca said. "You said 11 minutes. It's been 4. He watched Marco's face process this. I came here alone. That part was true. But the window was 60 minutes, and Adrian had a name and a word and 11 years of knowing exactly how to reach the people who needed to reach. The sound outside was getting closer. Organized. Multiple vehicles. The kind of coordinated approach that didn't sound like 2 Caruso SUVs sitting in a parking lot. It sounded like something that had been planned and was now executing. Marco stood up from behind the crate. He was still holding the gun, but the angle of his arm had changed. Not pointing, not quite at his side, something in between, the physical uncertainty of a man whose calculation has just been invalidated. How many? Marco said. Enough, Luca said. A beat. Then Marco set the gun on top of the crate with a deliberateness that was almost formal. He straightened his coat. He looked at Luca across the space with an expression that was complicated in ways Luca didn't have time to fully read. The woman in there, Marco said. She has nothing to do with any of this. I know. I want you to know that I never... The instruction was that she and the child were not to be harmed. That was explicit, and it was not conditional. Your line in the sand, Luca said. Yes. You burned her life 6 years ago and spent 3 years sending her roses to keep her frightened, but this was the line. Marco said nothing. It doesn't make you good, Luca said, but I heard you. He moved to the interior door and knocked. Not Marco's pattern, just 3 clean knocks, the kind without a code, and said clearly, It's Luca. Open the door. We're leaving. A pause from inside. Then the sound of a lock, and the door opened. The woman who'd been guarding them appeared first, her hands visible and her expression recalibrated into the neutral professionalism of someone who has just watched the situation change ownership and is updating her posture accordingly. She stepped back. She was very still as he passed her, the kind of still that said she'd made a decision to remove herself from the immediate geometry. Sarah was standing. She'd been standing already. She'd heard the shot, he realized. She'd heard the crash of the table and the shot, and she had stood up and positioned herself between Lily and the door and was holding Lily against her chest with both arms. Lily awake now and gripping her mother's collar with both small fists, wide-eyed and silent in the particular way of a child who has picked up on adult fear and doesn't have context for it, and is very carefully holding very still. Sarah looked at him. She looked at the blood on his jacket. Not his blood, but she didn't know that. And the weapon in his hand, and the doorway behind him. Now, he said. We go now. She didn't ask questions. That was Sarah. She could rage and challenge and demand accounting, but in the moment when the accounting was over and the situation required motion, she moved. She pulled Lily tighter and followed him. He took them back through the main space. Marco was standing where he'd been, coat straight, hands at his sides. He looked at Sarah as she passed, and something moved in his face that was not performed. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the back of Luca's coat and moved. The roll-up door was open. The night outside, it was night now, fully dark, the harbor black and flat beyond the industrial block, was full of headlights and organized noise. Reyes was outside. Luca had known him for 12 years, a man who operated at the intersection of Luca's world and the legitimate infrastructure that surrounded it, who had a skill set that was not easy to categorize but included the ability to move a significant number of organized people into a location in under 60 minutes when he received a particular word from a particular channel. He was standing beside a dark vehicle with his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a man who has arrived at a situation and is waiting for it to resolve into something actionable. Caruso vehicles, Luca said. Handled, Reyes said. He said it the way people say words that don't require elaboration. Marco Bellini is inside. What do you want done? Luca looked back at the building. Through the open roll-up door, he could see Marco's silhouette, standing exactly where he'd left him, not running, not trying for anything, just standing in the warehouse with his coat straight and his hands at his sides like a man waiting for what comes after a decision. Take him in, Luca said. Keep him intact. I'll determine the rest later. Reyes nodded and made a gesture, and 2 of his people moved toward the door. Luca turned to Sarah. She was standing beside the vehicle with Lily on her hip, Lily's face now buried in her mother's neck. And Sarah was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read in the dark, an expression that had too many layers to resolve quickly. Fear that hadn't finished metabolizing, relief that hadn't figured out where to land, anger that was real and not going anywhere, and underneath all of it, something else, something that had survived 6 years of deliberate burial and one night in a warehouse in Red Hook. "Are you hurt?" she said. Her voice came out rough. "No. The blood, not mine." She breathed out. One long breath, the kind that has been held for hours. Lily lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and looked at Luca. Her eyes were very large in the darkness. She had no framework for what had just happened. She had the vocabulary of a 3-year-old and the perceptions of someone who felt everything at a frequency most adults had lost. And she looked at him and said, with the directness of someone who has decided the most relevant fact, "You came." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I came." She held out one hand toward him, palm up, the same gesture she'd made in the park. Open, unconditional, the radical trust of a person who hasn't yet learned to be strategic about who she offers it to. He took her hand. She curled her small fingers around two of his and put her cheek back on her mother's shoulder, apparently satisfied that this arrangement was correct. He stood there in the dark outside a Red Hook warehouse, holding his daughter's hand and breathing harbor air and feeling the scar tissue under his ribs pulling with every inhale, and he thought that he had been in a significant number of high-stakes situations in his adult life and had walked out of all of them, but he had never walked out of one feeling precisely this way, which was a feeling he didn't have a clean word for and decided he didn't need one. Sarah was watching him. She hadn't spoken again. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were bright in the headlight wash, and she was clearly several hours away from being ready to say everything she needed to say about tonight, about all of it, and he understood that and was prepared for all of it. "Let's get you somewhere safe," he said. She nodded once. She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to. They got in the vehicle. The safe house was in Carroll Gardens, a brownstone that appeared in no documentation connected to his name, that he had maintained for 7 years against exactly the category of necessity that had just arrived. 2 bedrooms, functioning kitchen, security that was not invisible, cameras, locks, a system that Sarah would be able to see and understand rather than one she'd only discover later. He had decided this in the vehicle. No more invisible infrastructure. Whatever she was willing to accept, she would accept with full knowledge of what it was. She put Lily down in the back bedroom with a quiet efficiency that involved a stuffed rabbit she'd produced from her bag. Not Mr. Ears, a backup. Apparently Sarah had contingency plans for the contingency plans of a 3-year-old's emotional support system, and a low singing that was barely above a murmur, a song he didn't recognize. He stood in the hallway and didn't listen, and also heard every word. When she came out and pulled the door mostly closed, she turned and looked at him where he was leaning against the hallway wall, and for a moment they simply occupied the silence. "She'll sleep," Sarah said quietly. "Okay." "She doesn't know what happened. I said it was a surprise trip. She thought it was an adventure." "That was smart." "It was a lie." "A necessary one." "Yes." She moved past him toward the kitchen, and he followed, and she stood at the counter and looked at it without seeing it, and he sat down at the kitchen table because his legs had decided that the evening's expenditure of adrenaline was now presenting its invoice. She turned around. She looked at him sitting at the table. "Who were they?" she said. "The man who had you." "His name is Marco Bellini. He was my closest advisor for 19 years. He's been working against me for 4. And the other people, the ones outside. Mine. People I trust. The way you trusted Marco. Differently. Longer and differently." He held her gaze. "I know that's not a complete answer." "No, it's not." She leaned against the counter. "What happens now, to him?" "I'm still deciding." "Is he going to come after us again?" "No, the people he was working with, the Carusos, they've been contained tonight. Without their backing and without operational authority, Marco has nothing to threaten us with. The leverage is gone." She absorbed this. "And you? Are you going to be safe?" "I'm going to work on that," he said carefully. "That's not an answer either." "No," he said. "It's not." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm going to tell you the truth about something. The document he wanted me to sign tonight was structured so that my death would benefit him financially for the next 3 years. He was not planning to let me walk out. This conversation, all of it, was to buy time for something that was already decided." She was very still. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know what tonight actually was. And because if I'm going to ask you to let me be in your lives, in Lily's life, you need to have the accurate version of what you're dealing with. She looked at him for a long time. You could have told me that in the car. Yes. Why didn't you? Because you were holding Lily and she was almost asleep, and the accurate version of what you're dealing with felt like something that could wait 20 minutes. Something moved in Sarah's face. You made a parenting decision, she said. Yes, I suppose I did. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Not lighter exactly, but textured differently. Something in it had shifted slightly, the way a room shifts when a window is opened. He sent me flowers, said. Every year. White roses, no card. I thought someone had the wrong address, or it was a mistake. And then the third year I started to think maybe it was someone watching me, and I moved the following month. She looked at him. That was him. Yes. Making sure I stayed frightened, stayed away from you. Yes. She turned back to the counter and gripped the edge of it and stood with her back to him for a moment. Her shoulders moved with one deliberate breath. Luca, she said without turning around. Yes. I need you to understand something. Okay. She turned around. Her eyes were dry. She was not crying. She was too exhausted and too hollowed out for crying. She was in the place that comes after the crisis, where the body has run out of acute responses and is simply present. I am so angry at you for 6 years of decisions you made for both of us, for the years that Lily didn't have, for the fact that she spent 3 years asking me where her father was, and drawing pictures of a man she'd never met because she needed him to exist somewhere, even if it was only on paper. Her voice was controlled and precise, and it cost her something. I am not going to stop being angry about that on the basis of tonight. Tonight doesn't cancel 6 years. I know, he said. And I am not making any decisions about us, about what this looks like, about anything beyond the next 24 hours. My daughter is asleep in the back room and we're in a safe house, and that is the extent of my planning horizon right now. That's fair. But, she stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. But you came, tonight. You came into that building knowing it was a trap and she stopped again. She's going to remember tonight as the night of the surprise adventure. And I'm going to remember it as the night I watched you walk in somewhere to get us out, and I didn't know if you were going to come back through that door. Her voice dropped. I need you to know that I noticed that. I'm not ready to know what to do with it, but I noticed. He looked at her across the kitchen. Okay, he said quietly. She nodded once. She turned and filled a glass from the tap and drank it down and set the glass on the counter. She straightened up. You should have someone look at that, she said, gesturing at his jacket. It's not my blood. I know, you said. Look at it anyway. She walked past him toward the back bedroom, paused in the doorway, didn't turn around. There's a couch, she said, in the front room, if you're staying. I'm staying, he said. She went into the bedroom and pulled the door to. He sat at the kitchen table in the Carroll Gardens safe house and listened to the buildings settle around him and thought about 19 years of a man standing in his shadow and the specific architecture of resentment that duration could build. And he thought about a document designed to make his death profitable. And he thought about the sound of a child's voice in a dark parking lot saying, "You came like it was the only variable that had ever mattered." His phone buzzed. Adrian. Marco secured. Caruso's people are talking. 3 of Reyes's are down but stable. You okay? He typed back, yes, stay on it. I'll be in contact at 0600. He put the phone on the table. He looked at the kitchen ceiling, white, blank, the same indifferent surface he'd stared at in the recovery room 6 weeks ago, and thought about what he'd told himself that morning, when the world had looked like a series of clocks running out. He thought about Lily's hand around his fingers, the small, specific weight of it. He thought about the empty room on the 3rd floor of the townhouse, the bare walls and the wood floor, and the afternoon light through the uncovered window. He pulled out his phone again. He searched, child's bedroom furniture, New York delivery. He looked at the results for a long time. Then he put the phone away and leaned his head back against the kitchen chair and let his eyes close. He didn't sleep. But for the first time in longer than he could accurately calculate, the ceiling above him was not a blank surface he was staring at alone. And in the back room, very faintly, through the almost closed door, He could hear the soft, unguarded breathing of a child who had fallen asleep in a strange place with the complete confidence of someone who had decided the people around her were worth trusting. He sat with that sound and did not move. His phone buzzed again. A number he didn't recognize. Not a number from any directory he maintained, not a contact, not a routing he could immediately trace. He picked it up with the reflex of a man who had learned that unknown numbers in his world rarely meant nothing. The text was 4 words. "This isn't over, Luca." He stared at it. He looked toward the back bedroom door, at the thin line of light visible at the bottom of it, at the evidence of the 2 people sleeping on the other side of it. He typed back, "I know." He set the phone face down on the table. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth, and felt the scar tissue pull and held the physical reality of that. The proof that he had survived something, that the body was still here, still working, still making its argument for continuance. And he made himself sit with the thing he hadn't let himself fully feel yet, which was that the number could be Caruso directly, could be a piece of tonight's situation that hadn't been fully contained, could be the beginning of a next chapter. He hadn't finished reading the last one before encountering. He picked the phone back up. He typed a message to Reyes. "Unknown number contacted me. Tracing attached. Priority." He sent it with the number appended. Then he set the phone down again and listened to the building and the breathing and the distant harbor and the particular silence of a night that had not yet decided whether it was over, in a kitchen that was not his, in a life that was in the process of becoming something he didn't have a name for yet, but was, for the first time in 20 years, unwilling to walk away from. The phone screen lit up. Reyes's response came back in under 2 minutes, which told him Reyes was still running at full operational tempo, which told him Reyes had found something. Number traces to a burner purchased in Long Island City 6 days ago. Cell tower data places it active tonight in... Luca read the location. He read it twice. He sat up straight in the kitchen chair, the exhaustion leaving his body with the specific speed that adrenaline produces when the mind receives information that the body understands before the conscious mind finishes processing it. The number had been used tonight at the location Reyes had just sent, which was not where Marco had been, which was not where the Caruso vehicles had been, which was not anywhere on Luca's map of tonight's geometry, which meant there was someone else, someone who had been watching tonight from a position Luca hadn't known to account for, someone who had his private number, not the routing, the actual number, the one that only 6 people in the world had access to. Someone who had waited until Marco was contained and the Caruso's people were talking, and the immediate situation was resolved before sending 4 words that were not quite a threat and not quite a warning and not quite anything he could categorize with confidence. He stood up from the kitchen table. He moved to the front room and stood at the window and looked out at the Carroll Gardens street, at the parked cars and the brownstones and the ordinary nighttime geometry of a neighborhood that did not know what was happening inside this particular building, and he understood that he had resolved one crisis tonight with a precision he was almost proud of, and had walked directly into the antechamber of another one that he did not yet have the dimensions of. He thought about Marco saying the Carusos need the Moretti name gone. Not just the operations. The name. He thought about what kind of person sends 4 words to a private number at the exact moment when it would land with maximum effect. Not during the crisis, not before, but precisely after, in the exhale. In the moment when a man's guard drops because he has just survived something and is letting himself believe it is finished. He thought about who, in the architecture of tonight, had known enough to be watching from outside it. His hand was on the window frame, and the night outside was still and cold, and the street was empty, and somewhere behind him his daughter was sleeping, and the woman he had spent 6 years protecting from a distance was 3 rooms away. And the text on his phone said this isn't over and meant something specific. Something that pointed toward a variable he had not yet identified, a piece of the board he hadn't seen. And then his phone rang. Not a text. A call. The same unknown number. He looked at it for 1 full ring. 2. He picked up. Silence on the other end. Then a voice he had not heard in 11 years. A voice that belonged to a chapter of his life he had believed was permanently closed. A voice that produced in him the specific, involuntary response of someone who has just seen something they were certain was dead move. "Hello, Luca," the voice said. And the night, which he had believed was resolving, opened up beneath him like a floor that had never been as solid as he thought. He stood at the window with the phone against his ear and let the voice finish saying his name. Then he said, Vincent. Vincent Caruso. Not Donnie, the older brother, the one who had been removed from the family operation 11 years ago under circumstances that the world had been told involved a voluntary retirement to a property in Florida. Circumstances that Luca knew had involved a disagreement about methodology so fundamental that Donnie had chosen exile over partnership. The one who had, by all available intelligence, been out of the game for a decade. You're surprised, Vincent said. He had a voice like gravel under water, low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned that speed was for people who weren't sure they would win. Somewhat, Luca said. Donnie didn't tell you I was involved. No. Donnie didn't know. A pause. Marco didn't know either. They thought they were working with Caruso money and Caruso infrastructure. They were. They just didn't know whose specifically. Luca stood at the window and processed this with the focused attention of a man rearranging a map in real time. Vincent Caruso had funded Marco's operation without Marco knowing the source, which meant Marco had been a tool as much as he had been a principal, which meant the architecture of tonight went one layer deeper than he'd understood. What do you want? Luca said. To talk. We're talking. In person. Another pause. Tomorrow morning, I'll send a location. I'll come alone and I expect the same, genuinely alone, not your version, which I understand involves an interesting definition of the term. Why would I do that? Because the situation with Marco and Donnie's people is resolved, but the situation with me is not, and I am significantly more patient than either of them, and you have people you're now responsible for protecting on a longer timeline than one night. The voice was not threatening, it was simply precise. And because I knew your father, Luca, and there are things about your history that Marco was using as leverage that you should hear from someone who was there. The street outside was still empty. A cab moved past at the far end of the block, its light on, going somewhere that had nothing to do with any of this. My father has been dead for 22 years, Luca said. Yes, Vincent said, and there are things about how that happened that you've been told incorrectly. A silence. Tomorrow, Luca said. Send the location. He ended the call. He stood at the window for a long time after, long enough for the Carroll Gardens street to cycle through two more passing cars and a dog walker moving with the particular focused patience of someone whose schedule is determined entirely by another creature's biological needs. He stood and breathed and let the new information settle into its place in the architecture. And he thought about his father, about Enzo Moretti, dead at 53 of causes that had been explained to a 31-year-old Luca as the natural consequences of a particular kind of life, the kind of explanation that contains just enough truth to function as a substitute for the whole of it. He thought about what Marco had said. I covered for you during the years when the cardiac situation was affecting your judgment, and you didn't know it yet. Covered in what direction? Covered from whom? He went back to the kitchen and sat down and did not sleep. At 6 a.m. Sarah came out of the back room with the specific controlled quiet of someone moving through a space where a child is still sleeping. She was dressed. She'd found coffee in the kitchen cabinets. He'd had the safe house stocked on a standard rotation, the same way he maintained all his contingency infrastructure. And she started the machine without asking and stood waiting for it with her arms crossed and her back to him. He told her about Vincent Caruso. She listened without turning around until the coffee was done, then poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat across the table and looked at him with the eyes of someone who has had 4 hours of broken sleep in a strange place and has emerged from it with a clarity that rest might have softened. Your father, she said. Yes. And you believe him, that there's something to hear. I believe that he knows something. Whether what he tells me is accurate is a different question. But you're going. Yes. She wrapped both hands around her mug. And us. While you go to this meeting, what happens to us? You stay here. Reyes has people on the building, visible this time, not invisible. You know they're there and why. If anything feels wrong, you have a direct line to him that I'll program into your phone before I leave. He held her gaze. And I'll come back. That's not a promise I make casually. She looked at him steadily. I know you'll try. I'll come back, he said again, more simply, without qualification. She looked at her coffee. Lily asked for you this morning. Before she was fully awake, she said your name. Her voice was even, factual, the voice of someone reporting information rather than using it. She's never said your name. I've never used it in front of her. But she said it. He was quiet. I don't know what that means, Sarah said. I'm not saying it means anything. I'm telling you. Okay, he said. She's going to need things from you that you don't know how to give yet. Consistency. Ordinary things. Tuesday afternoon things. Not just the nights when there's a crisis to walk into. She looked up at him. I need to know you understand that the bar is Tuesday afternoons, not warehouses in Red Hook. I understand, he said. Do you want it? Not in the abstract, actually, specifically. Tuesday afternoons. He thought about the empty room on the third floor, the furniture search on his phone at 2 a.m, the specific gravity of a small hand around 2 fingers. Yes, he said. I want Tuesday afternoons. She nodded once. She drank her coffee. She looked at the table between them, at the ordinary ceramic surface of a mug, at the morning light coming through a kitchen window in Carroll Gardens. Don't get killed today, she said. I'll do my best. Something that was almost a smile crossed her face and didn't quite complete itself. That's the least reassuring thing you could have said. Probably, he agreed. Vincent Caruso had sent a diner. Of course he had. An old man with a point to make about origins would choose a diner, would choose the specific American grammar of a booth and a coffee machine, and the noise of other people's ordinary mornings as the backdrop for an extraordinary conversation. The place was in Bay Ridge, 20 minutes from Carroll Gardens, the kind of neighborhood that had been Italian for 60 years and was proud of the continuity. Vincent was already there. Booth in the back, coffee in front of him. A man in his early 70s who looked like what happened when a person who had been very powerful decided to stop performing the power and simply inhabited the residue of it. His hair was white and his hands on the table were steady, and he looked at Luca coming through the door with the expression of someone who has been waiting for this conversation for a long time and is not going to waste it by being dramatic about it. Luca sat down across from him. The waitress came. Luca ordered coffee he didn't need. You look like your father, Vincent said. I've been told. Around the eyes specifically. Enzo had the same, the way you hold your face when you're deciding whether to trust something. He did that. He picked up his cup. I knew him for 16 years, before you were born and after. You were friends. We were in the same world. In our world, that's a more complicated word than it is elsewhere. Vincent set the cup down. I'm going to tell you something that I've carried for 22 years, and I'm going to tell you because Marco Bellini had pieces of it and was using those pieces in ways that I find, he stopped, in ways that I find unacceptable. Whatever my other failings, I don't use dead men's secrets to control their children. Luca looked at him across the table. Tell me. Your father's death was not the result of the complications of a particular kind of life, Vincent said. It was the result of a decision made by 3 men, one of whom was my brother Donnie, who is 28 years old and ambitious in the specific way that young men in our world sometimes are, and who believed that Enzo Moretti was the obstacle between him and a territorial expansion he'd been planning for 2 years. The diner noise continued around them. Dishes, voices, the coffee machine. Ordinary morning sounds. Donnie arranged it, Luca said. His voice came out flat. Yes. And the other 2 men. One is dead, has been for 8 years. Unrelated matter. The other is Marco Bellini. Luca sat very still. Marco was 29, Vincent said. He was working for your father at the time. He provided information about Enzo's routing and schedule. He did it in exchange for a position. Donnie promised him a role in the expanded operation. A pause. What Donnie didn't anticipate was that you would consolidate so quickly after Enzo. You were 31, and you moved faster than anyone expected, and within 3 years you had built something larger than what Enzo had. And Marco's arrangement with Donnie became irrelevant because Marco had positioned himself inside your operation instead. Vincent's voice was precise and unhurried. Marco has been managing this secret for 22 years. It's why he couldn't let you fully step back from the operation. A Luca Moretti with distance and time to examine things would eventually find the thread. And it's why, when you survived the shooting and started reaching toward the woman and the child, he accelerated. A Luca Moretti with something to live for is a different kind of threat than a Luca Moretti who is simply powerful. Luca's hands were flat on the table. He looked at them. He thought about his father's face, which had become harder to retrieve over 22 years, which existed now primarily in photographs and in the specific quality of a mannerism he sometimes caught himself performing and recognized from somewhere he couldn't quite reach. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. "Because Donnie used my money and my infrastructure without my knowledge to fund Marco's operation," Vincent said. "And because my brother has been making decisions for 20 years that I don't endorse, and the time for my silence about that has run out." He looked at Luca directly. "And because you have a daughter, and she should know who her grandfather was without the version of that story being the one Marco would have told her." A silence. "What do you want in exchange?" Luca said. "Nothing that involves you," Vincent said. "My business with Donnie is my own, and I'll manage it in my own way. What I wanted from this conversation," he stopped. "I wanted you to have the true version, that's all. I'm 71 years old, and I'm tired of what accumulates when true versions don't get told." Luca looked at him across the booth and understood, with the particular instinct of a man who had spent 20 years reading rooms, that Vincent Caruso was telling the truth. Not all of the truth. There was no such thing in their world, but this specific truth, the one about Enzo, the one that had been buried for 22 years in the silence of 3 men and the managed ignorance of the son. He thought about Marco Bellini, about 19 years of proximity, about a man who had helped him build an empire that he'd been building partly on the foundation of a murder he had participated in, about the roses sent to Sarah every year, the mechanism of control, but also he understood now the mechanism of a man who was afraid of what would happen if Luca ever found peace. A man who needed Luca isolated and angry and without softness, because softness was the thing that led to reflection, and reflection was the thing that led to questions about his father. He thought about whether he was angry. He was. It was not a hot anger. It was the cold kind, the settled kind, the kind that doesn't require expression because it has already determined its own outcome. He was angry about his father, and he was angry about Sarah, and he was angry about 3 years of white roses delivered to a woman who deserved to feel safe, and the anger was real and legitimate, and he was going to carry it for a long time. He was also sitting in a Bay Ridge diner at 7 in the morning, across from a 71-year-old man who had chosen truth over convenience, aware that the anger was not the most important thing happening inside him right now. The most important thing was the address he'd left behind him in Carroll Gardens, and what it contained. "Marco," Luca said, "what happens to him is my decision." "Yes," Vincent said, "not yours, not Donnie's, mine." "Agreed." He looked at the table. "I'm going to transfer the documentation of his involvement in my father's death to channels that don't involve either of us directly. Law enforcement has been interested in certain cold cases for a long time, and Marco's financial movements over the past 14 months will provide adequate context for a more thorough investigation." He looked up at Vincent. "He'll be in a cell within 6 months. He'll stay there." Vincent nodded slowly. "And Donnie?" "That's yours," Luca said. "As you said." A pause. "Your father would have made the same call," Vincent said, "on all of it. He believed in institutions when he could use them. He said it was the most powerful weapon available to a man in our world because it was the only one your enemies couldn't anticipate." Luca drank his coffee. "Did he say that often?" "Often enough that I still hear it." Vincent looked at him with something that was not quite sadness and not quite its opposite. "He would have been proud of you. Whatever the complications of this particular week, he would have been proud." Luca didn't respond to that. It was too much to respond to at a diner table at 7 in the morning, too large to fit into the available space. He filed it somewhere he would return to later, alone, when there was room for it. He put money on the table and stood up. "One more thing," Vincent said. Luca paused. "The cardiac condition, the Moretti line." Vincent's voice was careful. "Your father had it, managed it for 15 years, kept it from almost everyone. His cardiologist at the time was a man named Castor. He's been retired for 12 years, but he's still in the city. He kept records, detailed ones. The management protocol Enzo used in the last decade of his life, before Donnie made it irrelevant, was extremely effective. Extended his functional years significantly beyond what the initial prognosis indicated." He paused. "I thought you might want to know the records exist." Luca looked at him. For you, Vincent said, and potentially for the child. He stood there for a moment in the Bay Ridge diner with the ordinary morning noise around him and the weight of everything he had just received, the truth about his father, the existence of records, the specific information that Enzo Moretti had lived well with what Luca now carried in his own blood. And he felt something move through him that was not manageable and not cold and not the kind of thing he was going to perform control about. Thank you, he said. He walked out into the morning. Okay. I was back in Carroll Gardens by 8:15. Reyes's people were visible on the street, as promised. Two of them, positioned with the particular casual non-naturalness of professionals, who are trying to look natural and are slightly too still to fully succeed. Luca nodded to them as he passed. Small acknowledgement. They nodded back. He let himself in with the key and stood in the entryway for a moment, listening. From the back room, Lily's voice, a running narration of something happening between her stuffed rabbit and an unnamed second party, the high serious tones of a child conducting important business. From the kitchen, the sound of the coffee machine running again, which meant Sarah was on her second cup, which meant she hadn't slept anymore after he left. He went to the kitchen doorway. She was sitting at the table with her hands around the mug and her eyes up and on the door as if she'd been watching it, which she had been. She looked at him in the doorway, and something in her face changed in the specific way that faces change when they've been braced for news, and the news is that the person is standing there, intact. It's done, he said. She breathed out. All of it. He came in and sat down. Vincent Caruso told me about my father. She looked at him carefully. What about him? He told her. He told her the whole of it. Donnie, Marco, the 22 years, the routing information traded for a position that became irrelevant, the managed secret that had shaped so much of what had happened between them without either of them knowing it was there. He told her about the cardiac records, about Enzo using the same inheritance for 15 years, effectively finding a way to live inside it rather than be defined by its prognosis. She listened without interrupting. She was very good at listening when the thing being said was important. She didn't perform attention, she simply gave it completely, the way she'd given it across a diner counter 9 years ago, when a man who gave her a false name had told her true things about himself without knowing that was what he was doing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Marco helped kill your father, she said. Yes. And has been managing your operation for 19 years. Yes. She looked at her mug. How do you feel about that? I'm deciding, he said. I'll tell you when I know. She nodded. She accepted that. And the Carusos. Donnie. Not my problem anymore. Vincent will manage his brother in whatever way Vincent manages things. It's not a situation that threatens us. You believe that. I believe it enough. He paused. I believe it more than I believed anything last week, which is the most accurate answer I can give you. She looked at him across the kitchen table. This woman he had loved from a distance for 6 years. This woman who had raised his daughter alone through the specific daily difficulty of that, who had moved apartments to escape anonymous flowers, and had built a life inside the constraints of a situation she hadn't chosen and hadn't been given the full truth about. She looked at him with the eyes of someone who is deciding something, not impulsively, not sentimentally, but with the full weight of everything she actually knows. I want to be clear about something, she said. Okay. I'm not going to pretend the last 6 years didn't happen. I'm not going to arrive at forgiveness quickly or easily, and I'm not going to perform it because the situation has resolved. That's not how I work. I know, and I need you to understand that what I'm about to say is not a declaration of anything. It is a statement of what I think is true. She held his gaze. I think Lily needs her father. I think she has needed him, and I think she is going to need him more as she gets older. And I think that the right thing, the correct thing, regardless of how I feel about you personally, is to let you be that for her, consistently, ordinarily, Tuesdays. Yes, he said, and I think that if you are going to be in her life, you need to be in it honestly. She needs to grow up knowing who you are and what you've done and what you're changing. Not the full weight of it, not yet, she's 3, but the true version, scaled to her age as she grows into it. Agreed. No more invisible infrastructure, no more decisions made for us without our knowledge. No more, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said finally. Just that. Okay. The word that contains an entire negotiation in 2 syllables. That means not "I forgive you" and not "I trust you yet," but I'm willing to find out if both of those things become possible. From the back room, footsteps, small and purposeful. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with Mr. Ears, the original, one-eared, structurally compromised Mr. Ears, which meant Sarah had had him in her bag all along, a backup to the backup, tucked under one arm and a crayon in her free hand, because she was apparently in the middle of something important and had simply relocated the operation. She looked at Luca. She had the same assessing pause she always had, the 3 seconds of the unfiltered inventory. Then she walked across the kitchen and climbed without invitation or hesitation onto the chair beside him, settled herself, and put Mr. Ears on the table and began to draw on the paper she'd apparently brought with her, which turned out to be the back of an envelope she'd found somewhere. She drew in silence for a moment. Then, without looking up, "Are you staying?" He looked at her profile. The dark curls, the serious downward attention of a child doing important work. "Yes," he said. She nodded once with the gravity of someone who has received a satisfactory answer to a significant inquiry and kept drawing. He looked at what she was drawing. A house. Tall, slightly lopsided, with 3 figures in front of it. One tall, one medium, one small. The small one was holding the tall one's hand. He looked at Sarah across the table. She was watching Lily draw with an expression that was not quite a smile, but had the same quiet weight. The expression of a woman who has been braced for a very long time and is very slowly, very carefully, beginning to put the weight down. He looked back at Lily's drawing. "Who is that?" he asked, pointing to the tall figure. She looked up at him with an expression that suggested this was, frankly, a strange question. "That's you," she said. Like it was obvious. Like it had always been obvious. Like she had always known exactly where he went in the picture. She went back to drawing. He sat in the Carroll Gardens kitchen with his daughter drawing at the table beside him, and the woman he loved 3 feet away, and the morning coming through the window in the ordinary way that mornings come, without drama, without ceremony, and he felt the scar tissue pull slightly as he breathed and let it be there. Let it be the evidence of what he'd survived and what it had cost him. Let it be the physical record of a man who had been running in the wrong direction for a long time and had finally, at significant personal expense, turned around. The cardiac records existed. Dr. Castor was in the city. Lily would be screened, and if there was something to find, they would find it early, and they would manage it the way Enzo had managed it, with information and care and the specific stubbornness of people who have decided to stay. Marco Bellini would be in a cell before summer. The documentation was already in motion, routed through channels that had nothing to do with Luca's name, that would surface in the form of an investigation that appeared to originate from entirely unrelated financial crimes. It was the kind of resolution his father had apparently believed in. He found he believed in it too. Donnie Caruso had a brother who was 71 years old and had run out of patience, and that was Donnie's problem. The empire, the operation, the machinery of 20 years, he had been in the process of dismantling it before any of this happened, and he would continue, slowly, carefully, through structures that were already in place. Adrian would manage the transition. Reyes would handle the security architecture. What remained at the end of that process would be legitimate businesses, a foundation that had already been funding pediatric cardiac research for 8 years under a name no one connected to him, and a life that he had not allowed himself to imagine for so long. That the imagining felt almost physically unfamiliar, like using a muscle that had been kept still. Lily finished the house and put her crayon down and looked at it with her head tilted slightly, the critical assessment of the artist reviewing completed work. "It needs a dog," she announced. "We don't have a dog," Sarah said. "We should get one," Lily said, with the tone of someone raising a point that has somehow been overlooked in the conversation for far too long. Sarah looked at Luca. The look said, "This is what Tuesdays look like." "We'll discuss it," Luca said. Lily appeared to find this adequate. She picked up her crayon and began to add a dog that looked like a cloud with 4 legs and a large smile. And the morning continued in the ordinary way that mornings do when the crisis is over and the work of ordinary life reasserts itself, which is the only way it knows how to continue. Forward, imperfect, with the next thing, and the one after that. He looked at his daughter's small hand moving across the paper. He had spent 20 years controlling an empire and had understood power as the distance you could maintain between yourself and the thing that could hurt you. And he had been wrong about that in the most fundamental way a person can be wrong about something, which is to mistake the avoidance of pain for the achievement of safety. The smallest hand in the world had corrected that error in a park on a Tuesday afternoon by reaching for him without strategy, without calculation, without any of the architecture of self-protection that adults construct between themselves and the people they need. He had spent 6 years watching from a distance. He had 30 years ahead of him if the medication held and the monitoring worked, and he made the changes that the doctor and the evidence and his own body were all making the same argument for. 30 years was enough. He put his hand flat on the table, next to Lily's drawing, and she looked at it and then put her small hand over two of his fingers the way she had in the park, the way she had at the warehouse, the way she apparently intended to whenever the opportunity presented itself, and went back to drawing the dog with her other hand. He looked at Sarah. She was looking at him, and her eyes were wet, not overflowing, just full, and she didn't look away. And he didn't look away. And there was nothing to say, yet that was large enough for the moment, so they didn't say anything. And that was also, it turned out, a kind of language. Outside, Carroll Gardens was conducting its morning. The dog walker was back on the street. Someone was opening the coffee place on the corner. A child somewhere in the building above them was running, the specific thunder of small feet on hardwood, the sound of someone who has not yet learned that you can move through the world more quietly. Lily added a second dog to the drawing without explanation or announcement. "Mama," she said, "can I have strawberries?" Sarah got up. She got the strawberries from the refrigerator. She had found them in there, part of the standard stock, and he had not mentioned that he'd ensured they were included in the rotation 6 months ago when he had updated the safe house provisioning, and he was not going to mention it because some things could simply be true without requiring an accounting of why they were true. She put the bowl on the table. Lily ate strawberries and drew and narrated nothing in particular to Mr. Ears, and Luca Moretti sat in an ordinary kitchen in Carroll Gardens with the morning on the window and his daughter's hand occasionally finding his and the woman he loved 3 feet away, and the rest of it, all of it, the empire and the blood, and the 20 years and the 6 years, and the scar under his ribs, and the father he had mourned incorrectly, and the truth he now carried correctly. The rest of it exactly where it belonged, which was behind him, in the past, where the dead live and the living do not have to. He stayed.